Well, and like you say, they're not looking for truth. They're looking to delegitimize the Jews. It's really interesting, the olive tree argument, because from my little, and I have a lot of really bad allergies, right? I'm allergic
Hmm.
to dust mites. So you're telling
Yeah,
me I'm not native to any place that has dust mites, which is
exactly.
planet Earth. So I'm really an alien. I'm a
Yeah.
lizard person from the center of the Earth where there's no dust, right? I mean, it's a ridiculous argument. So they acknowledge that we're the same people, unless they're talking to some like Western woke leftists, then all of a
Exactly.
sudden the Jews are Europeans who have nothing to
Yeah.
do with the seventh
Yeah.
century Jews we killed.
Yeah.
Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm here today with Josh, who is an antique collector who creates content on Israeli archaeology and history. His name on Instagram and TikTok and sometimes X, formerly Twitter, is underscore J0SH underscore A underscore. So we're going to throw that up
Yeah.
on the screen
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
watching, because that's a bit hard to follow otherwise. And on nehemiaswall.com, we'll also put in the link to his Instagram and TikTok and X. Josh, shalom, and thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I've been following your content for a while, and I love what you're doing because, a lot of the discussions that are going on online about Israel, let's say the Israel-Palestine conflict,
Yeah.
they're they're dealing with I don't even know how to put it. They're dealing with things that look, I come from an academic background, and I hear their arguments, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. Why would anybody even take that seriously? But you
Hmm.
take it seriously and you respond to it in such a concise way, and I love that. Like, for
Thank you.
example, there was some actress or something who was standing in front of a giant map that said Palestine, and you're like, wait a minute, let's actually look at
Yeah.
the details. And her point was like, Palestine has always existed. It's been a land that was stolen by the Jews. And so talk about that example, because that actually kind of went viral in the broader world. I don't even remember
Hmm.
what her name was or what she does, but it's probably not even important. But so you have right behind you, and I don't know, I'm always confused, right?
Yeah.
Right. So there's a map. Does that map say Palestine on it?
Yeah, it is. It's a 1800s map of Palestine.
Hmm.
It's like one of the many maps of Palestine that are spread online. Um, the interesting thing about it is that like 99% of those Palestine maps are actually biblical maps. They were maps that were added to Bibles or shown not to represent how Palestine looked when the map was created, but they were meant to represent how Palestine looked during biblical times. That's why on 99% of the times you'll find the tribes of Israel, or you'll find the regions in the time of Jesus, so it will include um, Judea, Samaria, and the Galilee. So that's why it's so easy for me to go and look at the map and say, okay, you saw the huge big title with Palestine, but then let's look at the details, and you'll find the list of the tribes of Israel, find Judah. In some cases, it would have a separation of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So um, it's very easy to debunk those claims that are based on those biblical maps.
So am I correct from your accent that you were born in Israel and raised? Am I right about that, or where are you originally from?
I lived most of my life in Israel. I spent a few years in England, but so I have a combination of
Okay.
English and Israeli accent. But yeah, I mostly live in Israel.
Okay. And I said before, like, I can kind of dismiss these arguments, but they're not trivial arguments in that they have an impact on real world situations. There's the famous story that Ehud Barak was at Camp David with, I want to say it was Bill Clinton. Yeah, Clinton and Arafat.
Mhm.
And they were talking about the Temple Mount. And Arafat brought up the argument. He said, how do you Jews even know your temple was there? And what they did is they opened up an encyclopedia. This was, I think, Clinton's idea. They opened up an encyclopedia. The encyclopedia mentioned the Jewish presence much more than it mentioned the Muslim presence. But then later, people dug up and they said, wait a minute, the Muslim authorities that run the Temple Mount, they themselves admitted in the past that the temple was there.
Yeah,
And so what they're doing is they're bringing these kind of like arguments that in the past they never made, just because they're convenient arguments and they can dupe people who don't know any better. And what I love is you're digging up and actually looking for those sources and showing, wait a minute, I can find this map that they're talking about, and it mentions the tribe of Judah, right? It doesn't
Yeah,
mention the tribe of Benny whatever. Um,
yeah.
so talk to me a little bit about that. Like, why is this important to debunk somebody who brings, like, I don't know, an 18th century map that says Palestine printed in Britain? Like, why is that important?
Yeah, well, it's the content I create is not there to convince any anti-Semite out there, or on like most cases, the people that bring up those maps of the tribes of Israel aren't really interested in the truth. They just have like a talking point, and they would use it, and tomorrow they'd use something else, and whatever sticks, great. So usually the purpose behind my content is to just show how absurd those claims are. Now, like, okay, there was people that used a few days ago, or like a few weeks ago, dug up research from 1990s about Israeli Jews and Arabs and their allergies to olive tree pollen. Like they took a couple of words from that research to make it seem as if 66% of all Israeli Jews are allergic to olive trees, and that's a proof that Jews are not indigenous to the land of Israel. Um, and then, like, when I see that kind of stupidity, it's very easy. Okay, that's the research they brought up. Let's open it and see what's actually written there. And what's actually written there is that first of all, the name of the olive tree is European olive tree, so it's not unique to the
So
land of
that proves
Israel.
Jews are not native to Europe.
Yeah, but even more, like, and then it wasn't 66% of all Israeli Jews, it was 60% of Jews that already have allergies to other things. So it's not most Israelis, it's most Israelis with allergies also have allergy to that European olive tree. So um, it's
Okay.
very, when you like show the absurdity and like any type of claim. Okay, so bringing up an ancient coin with a Hebrew letter of Lecherut Zion and calling it a Canaanite coin, it's very easy to say, okay, well, let's read the
Wait,
letters
wait,
here.
wait. Tell us about that coin, and we'll
Yeah,
throw it up on the screen if my editor can find it. So and
yeah.
what is their argument? Because I don't know that I've heard that argument.
Okay, so there's an argument that the Israelis are stealing everything. All of the Israeli history is stealing. And now, like, if you look at the modern shekel, for example, the modern Israeli shekel, it has an image of a lily flower. So some kind of Palestinian creator said, okay, this lily flower looks very similar to an ancient Palestinian Canaanite coin, and like they put those images together and say, look, Israelis are stealing our Canaanite shekels. Um, but the thing is that that Canaanite shekel that they're talking about that we stole is actually a Jewish coin from the first revolt against the Romans between 66 CE to 70 CE, and has a Paleo Hebrew inscription of the Cherut Zion, for the freedom of Zion. Like, it's not, you can argue that Paleo Hebrew is a Canaanite script, but it's Hebrew with for the freedom of Zion, nothing related to any Palestinian Arab identity. Um,
And literally the word Sion, Zion, is on the coin, and they're saying
yeah,
we stole that.
yeah.
Right. This
So
this is
like,
part of this whole delusion of what they call cultural appropriation, right? It's almost like
yeah,
what do they call that? A moral panic, right? Because
yeah,
cultures diffuse, and I mean, this is one of the basic concepts in humanities is that cultures aren't static, and they spread and they influence each other, and they're
of
dynamic.
course.
So when it's like, here's an example, guys. So they'll say, Israel's national food is supposedly falafel. It's not, but that's what they
Mhm.
tell the tourists. Um, and right, like, how often do you eat falafel, Josh? I don't know. Is it
I have a good falafel place next to my house, so
okay?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
when I lived in Israel for 20 years, maybe it was like once every 2 months I would eat falafel.
Yeah,
Schnitzel, though, on a regular basis. But so they'll say, oh, falafel, it's a Palestinian food and the Jews stole it from us. Well, first of all, I mean, and where did you get like pasta, right? Like, give me a break, right? You know, that
yeah.
so the Italians stole it from the Chinese. Like, what are we talking about here, right? Um, but actually
But
it
then
was
also Egyptians like are the ones that eat falafel, and like
right.
the
It's the
Egyptians.
Copts in Egypt who specifically established it because during Lent, which is like a Christian observance, they don't eat
Yeah,
meat. So they
yeah.
invented falafel to eat during Lent. So the Palestinians, they borrowed it. I mean, who stole, right? It's good food,
Hmm.
so we eat it, right? They took it
Yeah,
from the Copts. And, do we take it from the Copts or probably we got it from, I would imagine, from the Moroccan Jews or some other North African Jews, I would imagine. But
yeah.
right, and that's we didn't get it directly. Even if we got it from the Palestinians, so what? It's food. Like what? It's a ridiculous thing.
Yeah,
Ridiculous.
like first of all, like there was a huge Jewish community in Egypt,
Mhm.
that was even after independence war, there was still a huge Jewish community. Like I think in the 1950s, there was a football team called Maccabi Kahir, and they won the Egyptian national football championship, like in 1951 or something. Like there were Jews all
So
living there.
Maccabi Cairo was the team that won
Yeah,
the Egyptian national championship. Yeah.
yeah,
Do you know
yeah.
what happened to those Jews? Because I had a very dear friend who passed away a number of years ago, who was born in Cairo,
Hmm.
and he walked around with this petek, this like piece of paper in his wallet
Yeah,
for
yeah,
decades. And he found it in his mailbox one day, and it said, "You have 1 week to leave the country. You can take 20 kilograms with you and nothing of great value." And he walked
yeah.
around with that for decades because he didn't understand, like, how come I'm not considered a refugee? My
Yeah.
ancestors lived in Egypt maybe since the time of Jeremiah, or maybe before that.
Hmm.
If you look at like the Elephantine papyri, right? Like they're Jews living in the 7th century BCE in Egypt,
Yeah.
and they're expelled one day by a government decree because Israel had
Hmm.
a war with Egypt, and Egypt said, "We're going to take revenge. We're going to expel all our Jews," and that wasn't all,
Yeah.
but it was most of the Jews. And so you're right. There were ancient Jewish communities. It's interesting. We'll talk. There's this weird thing about this cultural appropriation, but like, come on, when you think of Indian food, you think of really hot, spicy food. How
Yeah.
long has the hot, spicy element, the pepper, been in India? Not longer than the time of
But,
Christopher Columbus, because it comes from the
yeah.
Americas. And nobody says, "Oh, that's cultural appropriation. Those Indians, give back the peppers, give back the peppers." Nobody
Yeah.
says that. It's ridiculous. Whereas
Yeah,
we
and then at the end
food,
of the day, they just like take the term that sounds bad and just inflict on all the Jews. Like if Jews are eating food that is similar to ours, okay, that's cultural appropriation. If they're eating the filter fish, they don't adapt to. They're not from this region. Like anything you can throw, they can be contradicting even. If it's negative, if it has a negative sounding effect. So let's say the Jews are doing that.
well, and like you say, they're not looking for truth. They're looking to delegitimize the Jews. It's really interesting, the olive tree argument, because for my little, and I have a lot of really bad allergies, right? I'm allergic
Hmm.
to dust mites. So you're telling
Yeah,
me I'm not native to any place that has dust mites, which is
exactly.
planet Earth. So I'm really an alien. I'm a
Yeah.
lizard person from the center of the Earth where there's no dust, right? I mean, it's a ridiculous argument. It really is a ridiculous argument. It also has to do with, I think, if I'm not mistaken, people who are raised around farm animals have a much lower incidence of allergies because they're
Hmm.
exposed to these like intensive allergens from when they're very young.
Yeah, so I had like different things about it. Like first of all, like from what I saw, from what I read, like I'm not a big scientist, but like allergies are caused by exposure. So like if there's no exposure at all, probably you wouldn't develop an allergy. So like for example, I saw statistics from Finland that they are not allergic at all to olive trees because there are no olive trees there, so they don't. There's nothing to be allergic to. And then there's the like in that research trying to explain why there's a bit of a difference between Jews and Arabs. With existing allergies, the issue of hygiene and like if culture, if you uh, more your hygiene systems are different, it would maybe have a different effect in terms of what kind of allergies you develop. So, but
I can tell you, my sisters are firm believers that if you have too hygienic an environment, you'll expose your babies to diseases.
yeah,
And I don't know if the scientific community accepts that or not, but like there
yeah,
definitely was a period where we, meaning we as in Western civilization, we washed down every surface and
hmm,
prevented children from having, any kind of, as much as we could, any kind of like cold. And then when they got older, they had really big problems.
exactly,
Um,
yeah.
all right, so talk to me, tell the audience, what is the Palestinian argument here? Let's assume they've never heard any of this, never been exposed to any of this. What is the argument they're trying to make here? Because it's not obvious to somebody coming from my background at first. What is the claim here about Jews and
Yeah,
Palestinians?
yeah. So like the basic story that I hear or that is being told is that Jews are a bunch of Europeans that decided in 1948 that God promised them Palestine 3,000 years ago, so they came and colonized Palestine, and that's it. That's like the story. And then, like, it can have different variations. Okay, it didn't happen in 1948, it happened in 1917. Rothschild, that was a Zionist, he paid off the British to colonize Palestine, and all of that is based on some kind of religious mythology to excuse the colonialism of or colonizing Palestine. So that's like a big framework that's within it. They try to, okay, they stole the Canaanite shekel, and look, they are allergic. All of them are allergic to olive trees, and all of those other ridiculous stories lie on the idea that Jews or Israelis are a bunch of European colonizers that one day decided that God promised them the land.
So my friend who was expelled from Egypt in 1956 is a European colonizer.
Exactly.
So I feel like you're missing a piece. So they say the Jews are these Europeans who just showed up in 1917 or 1948 or something. What do they say about the Palestinians?
The Palestinians are the native people who always lived in Palestine for 4,000 years. It has an interesting
Oh.
book. Try to find it. Let's see. Yeah. By Noam Salha, Palestine, 4,000-year history. Now, what I love about this book is that the mosaic here is a Madaba mosaic. It's a Byzantine mosaic found in Jordan from, I think, the 6th century, if I'm not mistaken. And like this in the center is Jerusalem. What you can see here is Benjamin, it's basically a biblical map, like all of those other maps of Palestine. It's a biblical map showing the 12 tribes of Israel. The term, like there's a huge section of Judah on it. It's not shown on this cover, but if you look and find the original Madaba mosaic, you can see like it has big Judah, like the term Israel appears on it twice, and like the history, the 4,000 years history of Palestine is like a biblical map of the tribes of Israel. So yeah,
That's a bit ironic. I actually saw the Medva map when I was in Jordan in 2007. It's in a
yeah,
Byzantine church. And yeah, he's just showing Jerusalem there, but it's a map of, at least of what's survived as large parts of Israel. And so you're
yeah,
saying on the Medva map, it has the word Israel itself. And
yeah.
so their 4,000
It
year
has a word used
history.
Israel twice. Now, like
Right.
the term Israel on the Meta map is, it doesn't, it's more about the nation of Israel. So, like, there's an area in Refidim where Israel fought against Amalek, and then I think there's another area where Moses showed Israel the copper snake or something like that. So, like, it's biblical references to the nation of Israel living there. No mention of any
Does
Palestinian
that
Arab
map mention the word
tribes.
Palestine on it?
So yeah, there is on the border between Pleshet and Egypt. This is the border of Pleshet or Palestine. So there is a reference to what you could interpret as Palestine, where the Bible refers to as Pleshet, like
Tell
the
us what
southern.
Pleshet is.
Yeah. So well, I think you know better than me, but
Well, yeah, but my audience has heard me lots of times. I wanted to hear it from someone who's in the fields dealing
yeah,
with these issues, in the
yeah. So
trenches.
so basically, around I would say the 12th century BCE, a bit before, there was an invasion of the sea people coming from the sea, basically trying to take land in the coast of, well, what was then Canaan, Egypt, and then there are inscriptions like mentioning the Egyptians fighting against those sea people. That one of those groups were called Pleshet. Finally, they settled in the southern coast of Israel in cities like Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gat, Ekron. And they were, well, the enemies of Israel. According to the Bible, there are many fights between the Israelites and the Philistines. And like they were a very strong or dominant power until around the 7th century BCE, if I'm not mistaken. And then like the Assyrians came over, and they were like Assyrians, and then later on Babylonians fought against them, and at 7th century BCE they're already expelled, and no continuation to the Philistine culture apart from the area where they used to live that was still referred to as Pleshet. This is where the Philistines used to live. But the funny thing about it is, first, from what I understand, we don't have really any records about mentioning what they call themselves. There are texts, like I saw in the Israel Museum, some like records from the Philistine culture, but none of them are like talking about themselves. So like, we don't really know what they call themselves. We only know what surrounding entities call them.
So Philistine is what the people around them call them. And what is the etymology of the word Philistine?
Well, in Hebrew, it comes from palash, or like invader. So like,
So
there
they probably
are,
didn't call themselves invaders. That's what they were called apparently by the surrounding peoples.
yeah.
And that's the origin of the word Palestinian, you're saying.
Mhm.
But you're saying the Palestinians, they aren't descendants of the ancient invaders, the ancient Philistines.
Well, there weren't any Philistines left until in the 7th century. Like they were expelled to Mesopotamia, and like a bit later, you could still find inscriptions in Mesopotamia referring to people that refer to themselves as Ashdodim, like people from Ashdod. So like they did like continue their communities a bit longer after they were expelled, but yeah, that culture died out. Like there are no Philistines. When the return of Zion, when the Jews expelled later on by Babylonians and returned by in the time of the Persians, there are no Philistines to deal with because that culture was gone. There
Oh, so
was.
that's interesting. So when it mentions the enemies of the Jews who returned in Ezra and Nehemiah, it mentions Sanballat the Horonite, and it mentions
Mhm.
Geshem Ha'aravi, but it doesn't
Yeah,
mention the Philistines. That's interesting.
yeah.
Okay, very
And
interesting.
by the way, on that, like a Zionist talking point is that Jews are from Judea, Arabs are from Arabia, and that is, of course, like true because Jews are from Judea and Arabs did come from Arabia. But this, like, I feel that that the trying, like the Palestinian attempts to link themselves to those Philistines or link themselves to other groups is because they're kind of don't want to call themselves Arabs because like they feel that it's not it's not their land. So okay, if we identify as Arabs, it basically means that we are not from this area. But like you mentioned, like Geshem Aravi, there were Arab kingdoms in the Levant, not specifically in the land of Israel, but in the area of like modern day Jordan. The Nabateans were considered an Arab tribe. They did take over parts of Idumea, that is now in modern day Israel in the desert. So there were Arabs in the Levant, even like the Clark monolith from the 9th century BC, mentioning King Achav and a coalition of kings fighting against the Assyrians. One of those allies is Gindibu Haravi, like an Arab.
And it's my understanding that's
King.
probably the first reference to an Arab anywhere in history. If I'm not
Exactly.
might be mistaken.
Yeah. I think so too. And like, so there were Arabs in the Levant, like,
And by Levant, you mean the area of Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, that whole area is called the Levant.
Yeah. So like there were, and like, so I think like, people should say, okay, we are Arabs. Arabs did live here. And like, I don't, a bit more than 20% of modern day Israelis are Arabs, and there's no shame. Identity. I think they should have a lot of pride in their identity, not try to link themselves to groups that they were never part of their culture.
Well, here's a really interesting kind of like historical sort of problem. So when you say like the Turks, they don't. Very few people would say, well, the Turks are foreigners in Turkey and they're invaders and conquerors, but obviously they are, because the ancient population of Turkey wasn't Turkish, it was Greek, and it was, different people in that area. So how far back do you go? That's one of the questions, right? Meaning, like, this is a problem that comes up in American history when they'll say, a certain Native American tribe, they've always been in that land. Well, wait a minute, no, we know that in like the 18th century, they got guns from the Europeans and they went and conquered and wiped out this other tribe.
Yeah.
And they're really from Ohio, not Minnesota or someplace like that, right? So who decides what the time frame is, right? So if we decide the time frame is I don't know, 100 years, let's say 200 years, then maybe you could say the Palestinians are native to that. Even that's not entirely true, because the whole thing, right? The immigration in the 1880s. All right. So the UN actually made a decision. If you were there in 1942, I believe is the date, something like that, then you're a native, right? It's some kind of thing like that.
There is like the definition of a Palestinian refugee is basically whoever if you lived in the British Mandate of Palestine between 1946 to 1948, that makes you a Palestinian. Then if you lost, lost your home or whatever because of the conflict, you are a Palestinian refugee. And like they deliberately took like very short period of time, because there are a lot. First of all, there was Arab immigration into the land of Israel was there from the early 1800s, like from the in 1834, when Ibrahim Pasha from Egypt, like he had a whole big quest to try to take over Damascus. Basically, he went through the land of Israel, tried to fight against the Ottomans, like that were tried to gain a bit more independence. That led a lot of Egyptians, first of all, to flee, because he had mandatory recruitment to the Egyptian army that nobody liked. So a lot of Egyptians moved from Egypt to the land of Israel, and a lot of new villages were formed in the land of Israel at the time. And they added, like, for example, in Nablus, half of the families have Egyptian origins from that time period. And then, of course, after the Zionist movement came and started developing the swamplands and the dunes, so many more immigrants came from all over the Arab world. There's like stories about how in like areas that were deserted, like once you had a Jewish village there, suddenly you'd find 4 or 5 Arab villages next to it for all of the workers that try to come and work in that new village. So yeah, there's a lot of immigration. The immigration laws for Muslims at the time of the British Mandate were much more relaxed compared to the Jewish people, especially after the different white white books. So
So what you're saying
uh, yeah,
is even if we were to stipulate, which probably isn't the case, but even if we were to say that some Palestinians are descended from ancient Canaanites, a large percentage immigrated within relatively recent memory in the
exactly,
1800s and on, and they're
exactly.
taking on the same alleged or supposed identity that we're the indigenous people of this land. We've been here for 4,000 years, even though they'll have a surname like Al Masri, the Egyptian, or Al
Hmm.
Hawrani, the person from Hawran, which is in Syria.
Yeah,
Very
but
apparently common name.
I love like one of the things. So, by the way, there was also a huge immigration out of the land of Israel during
Hmm.
the 1800s. The Christian population didn't
Hmm.
have a good time here, and a lot of them fled to South America. There's a huge, big Palestinian
Hmm.
diaspora. I think the largest Palestinian diaspora is in South America and Chile. And it's before the time of the Zionist movement. It's when the Turks were basically genociding the Armenians, the Greeks. They're very like hostile towards the Christians. So it did make a lot of Palestinians flee, or Christians that were actually there. You could argue that they are more indigenous than the modern day Palestinian Muslims living here. Um, but yeah, and but like one example that I like is that during that same time period when the Christians were fleeing, the Ottomans were trying to import Muslims from different areas. So
Hmm.
there's a huge, well, there was a big, relatively big Muslim community from Bosnia, like Europeans that settled in the land of
Literal
Israel.
Europeans, right?
Literally Europeans, yeah. So, like, you have a bunch of Europeans that have no ties to the land of Israel settled here. And a lot of them, like the Bosniak surname is, all of them have like surnames indicating where they came from, like Al-Masri from Egypt. So, like, you have Bosniak from Bosnia. And later on, they joined to kind of terrorist organizations fighting against the Jews. So, like, you'd have literally European immigrants fighting against the indigenous people, but not the way you'd think about it. It's yeah,
Well, I remember seeing what is her name? She's the little blue-eyed terrorist, Altan.
Ahed Tamimi. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and she's being brought into court by this Ethiopian Jewish policewoman. And the narrative is the white European colonizers are oppressing the native brown Palestinians. The girl's got
yeah,
blonde hair and blue eyes. Like, what are you talking about, right? She's probably the descendant of some crusader or something like that, you know.
yeah.
Um,
I think like the skin color, like they try like all of the talk is trying to like import dynamics that is happening in the United States, I believe. Like, they're
mhm.
trying to like, okay, there's a whole if you're white is bad, brown is good, and they're trying to bring that terminology to the land of Israel. And okay, if they're indigenous, they must be brown, and if they're foreign colonizers, they must be white. But like when you look at the actual communities that like DNA tests prove that have the most similarities to the ancient Canaanites because they never left the region, and they were, the people that actually stuck here are, well, on the top of the list, you have the Samaritans, and they're like, much whiter than me. Like, they are
They are
like,
whiter than you, it's true.
yeah, they're like, they are like, a lot of them have blue eyes, like, they're really pale. And like second on the list, you have like the Druze community. Um, and then like I saw just a few days ago, there was a group of Druze sheikhs that came from Syria to Israel to holiday celebration. And like, the bright Europeans with blue eyes, like they are the most science proves that they are the people that stuck here for the most. And their skin color is much lighter than any of those other people trying to claim that they are the indigenous people. So I think like that skin color game isn't really
There's a lot of
true.
confusion about skin color. I know that in Islamic sources it talks about their prophet that he was something like he was among the whitest of men or something, and
Yeah,
it and they'll say, "Oh no, that just means he was very honest," or something like that. That's even
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
what. Okay, let's not get into that. But so there's definitely a lot of confusion about skin tone and skin color, and like it talks about King David being ready,
mhm.
Admoni. So and there's different explanations that Bible scholars will say, well, it means he didn't have a lot of facial hair, so the redness of
Yeah.
his face showed up. Okay. Um,
Yeah.
that kind of means he probably had somewhat of a pale complexion. I don't know. Um,
Yeah, but like then like comments I would get is, oh, the Jews left black and they turned white, but
right, but you know
no,
who
like
said that? Nasser said that. Nasser, whose goal was to kill all the Jews.
yeah.
And let's say that's true. And my ancestor was, I don't know if I can say this on social media, was
Mhm.
or on if this is published on YouTube. So I'll just say my ancestor had a very unfortunate encounter with a Cossack, right?
Mhm.
So let's say that's true. So what? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
so what is that? Okay, that's horrible. That kind of thing happened, no doubt. Or with a Roman soldier or something, right? Um, that definitely could have happened. Does that make me Roman? Well,
Mhm.
my people have been persecuted for 2,000 years for being Jewish. It's only now all of a sudden that, oh, well, you're not really a Jew. I was going to say it's funny, but it's not funny. I saw a
Yeah.
video of this man who was bragging about the October 7th attacks in Gaza, and he was saying, look what we did to the Bani Israel, right? So like this is kind of like a message that they're putting out externally. These aren't real Jews until it comes to, well, why do we want to kill them? Because they killed all the prophets. It says it in the Quran, right?
Yeah.
Well, who killed all the prophets? The
Yeah.
Poles?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Germans? No, it's the Yahud. And right there, they weren't saying, Itbach el Polani or whatever, right? They were saying
Exactly.
slaughter the Jews, right? And
Yeah.
they equate that with Bani Israel, the children of Israel. So it's a kind
Yeah,
of a
I
disingenuous
often find
argument.
it like I find it like on Western translations, like when they try to translate things that are said in Arabic, like they would go around and saying "Itabach el Yahud" or whatever. The English subtitles would be "Revenge against Zionists." So like
Oh
they're
wow!
like,
But what does it really mean? Tell our audience who doesn't know what that means.
well, when they chant "Itabach el Yahud," Yahud means Jew. They are trying to
It means slaughter the
uh,
Jew,
slaughter the Jew. Yeah,
right? And
but.
that's a
It,
common Palestinian chant,
It's a common
unfortunately.
person. Yeah, that and Khaybar Yahud when they're mentioning how
So tell us
um
what Chaybar is. I'm imagining most people don't know who are listening.
yeah, the Battle of Khaybar is basically there were there were a lot of Jewish tribes in the Arabian Peninsula that, well, didn't accept Islam or were not convinced by that new religion. And long story short, they were all slaughtered with women, children, etc. Battle of Khaybar is they were tricked to believe that there would be some kind of peace agreement, and then when Muhammad arrived, it wasn't so peaceful after all. And a lot of time in ceasefire demonstrations or stop the war in Gaza, the chant in Arabic could be Haider Haider Ya Yahud, Yesh Muhammad Sayaud, like the remember Haider, how Jews, the army of Muhammad will be back and continue doing what happened in Haider.
But we're going to
Um,
slaughter every one of you like we did in the 7th century is what
yeah,
they're chanting. Okay. So they acknowledge that we're the same people, unless they're talking to some like Western woke leftists, then all of a
exactly.
sudden the Jews are Europeans who have nothing to
Yeah,
do with the 7th
yeah.
century Jews we killed.
Yeah, basically we are the bad, and now we place bad in what is like the word for bad in your culture. Like in our culture, bad means Jew, great, and then in your Western culture, bad means white European. Okay, so he's a white European. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's a double messaging.
Okay, any final words? Where can people find your videos and any final words for the audience?
Well, my videos are on Instagram and on TikTok. Just
And we'll
search
put up the
for
link on
JR.
kentool.com.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I think that what's like the important like message I try to bring up, or what I try to highlight, is that first of all, Jews have always lived in the land of Israel non-stop for over 3,000 years or so. As a continuous Jewish presence in our homeland. Jews are the only people that had a local sovereign entity in multiple occasions. Like, so the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Later on, you had the Hasmonean and Herodian kingdoms of Judea. You had different revolts, like the first revolt, second revolt. You had a revolt in the 4th century. You had a revolt in 7th century. That in all of those occasions, Jews had self-determination and control in the land of Israel. That's the only. There was never any independent Arab sovereign state, in all of that 4,000 years of Palestine. So yeah, Jews are and like trying to claim that Jews are, those Europeans are sticking to that divine promise that God promised us the land 3,000 years ago. It's not an argument, because when I put up, you can tell me that the Bible is a fairy tale and great. I don't have evidence for Moses splitting in two, but I do have evidence for King Hezekiah when he was fighting against the Assyrians, and the Paleo Hebrew inscription says belongs to the king, Lamelech Hebron. So I don't need the Bible. The Bible helps understand, okay, what are these archaeological Hebrew findings that say, okay, you can see something mentioning King Hezekiah. Great, we have the Bible to confirm it. But even without the Bible, there are plenty of archaeological evidence throughout all of those 3,000 years of Jews living in their homeland. It's not a biblical myth. It's the Jews living here created the Bible, or I don't know, lived with the Bible as part of their religious system. But if you take religion aside, you still have the hard archaeological evidence that no other nation has in this place.
Well, thank you, Josh, so much for joining me. And guys, go check out his channel on Instagram and on TikTok. Shalom.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemiah Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemiah's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiahswall.com.